Welcome to Money Mode, the channel that makes money talk less confusing and way more useful. Let's get into it. Every time the news mentions the economy, one number always shows up. GDP is up. GDP is down. GDP grew slower than expected. But have you ever stopped to ask what that number actually means, and why economists, investors, and even your own government treat it like the ultimate scoreboard? Today, we are breaking down GDP in a way that finally makes sense. No jargon, no confusion, just the real story behind the number that moves markets and shapes headlines. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. In the simplest terms, it measures the total value of everything a country produces in a given period, usually a quarter or a year. Every coffee sold, every house built, every software subscription, every haircut, every exported car. Add it all together, and you get GDP. Think of it as a giant receipt for an entire nation's economic activity. Economists usually break GDP into four main pieces. The first is consumption, everything households spend on, from groceries to streaming services, usually the biggest slice of the pie. The second is investment, meaning businesses building factories, buying equipment, or constructing new offices. The third is government spending, covering schools, hospitals, roads, and public salaries. The fourth is net exports, the value of everything a country sells abroad minus everything it buys from other countries. Add consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports together, and that total is GDP. When any of these four pieces grows, GDP tends to grow with it. When they shrink, especially consumer spending, GDP often shrinks too. Now, here is where it gets interesting. You will often hear two versions of GDP mentioned: nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is measured using current prices, so if prices rise due to inflation, nominal GDP can look bigger even if the country did not actually produce more. Real GDP strips out the effect of inflation, showing the true growth in production. This is why economists almost always care more about real GDP. It tells you whether an economy is genuinely expanding or just experiencing rising prices. So why does this number dominate the news? Because GDP growth is treated as the heartbeat of an economy. When GDP grows steadily, it usually means businesses are hiring, incomes are rising, and consumers are spending with confidence. When GDP shrinks for 2 consecutive quarters, many economists label that a recession, a word that can shake financial markets, influence interest rate decisions, and even affect elections. Central banks watch GDP closely too. If growth is too fast, it can trigger inflation, prompting banks to raise interest rates to cool things down. If growth is too slow or negative, banks may cut interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending. This is why every GDP report can quietly move stock markets, currency values, and even the interest rate on your next loan. There is another number worth knowing: GDP per capita. This takes total GDP and divides it by the population, giving a rough idea of average economic output per person. It is often used to compare living standards between countries, though it does not capture how wealth is actually distributed among citizens. But GDP is not perfect. It does not measure happiness, health, or quality of life. A country could have rising GDP while pollution increases, work hours lengthen, and inequality widens. It also does not count unpaid work, like caregiving, even though that work has enormous value to society. Because of these blind spots, many economists argue GDP should never be viewed alone, but alongside indicators like employment rates, wage growth, and access to healthcare and education. Still, despite its flaws, GDP remains the most widely used snapshot of economic health because it is consistent, comparable across countries, and updated regularly. It gives investors, businesses, and policymakers a shared language to describe how an economy is performing right now and where it might be heading next. So the next time a headline says GDP grew by 2% or a country slipped into recession, you will understand exactly what is being measured and why the entire financial world pays such close attention to a single number. If this made economics feel a little less intimidating, that is exactly the goal. Understanding numbers like GDP helps you make sense of the bigger financial picture, from job markets to interest rates to the price of everyday goods. Follow along for more videos that break down the economy, one concept at a time, in a way that actually makes sense. This video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial or investment advice.